Sometimes the most important moments in our lives come when we least expect them. A single act of kindness can change everything, especially when two people from completely different worlds cross paths. In the remote wilderness of Wyoming Territory, a mountain man discovers a wounded woman collapsed against a barn. He tends to her injuries without asking questions, using the survival skills he's learned from years alone in these mountains. She's wearing torn silk and fine boots, clearly not from around here. He figures she's just a traveler in trouble, but this stranger holds a secret. She's the wealthiest woman in the entire territory. What happens when a man who has nothing saves a woman who has everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jacob Stone had learned long ago that peace was something you built with your own two hands, one day at a time. For 15 years, he'd been doing exactly that in these Wyoming mountains, far from the noise and complications of civilization. At 45, his hands were calloused and strong, his face weathered by sun and wind, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. He moved through the wilderness with the quiet confidence of a man who knew every rock, every stream, every animal trail within 20 miles of his cabin. This morning, like most mornings, he rose before dawn. The ritual was always the same, and he took comfort in that predictability. He started the fire in his stone hearth, filled his battered coffee pot with water from the creek that ran 50 yards from his door, and measured out grounds with the precision of habit. While the coffee heated, he stepped onto his porch and simply listened. The forest waking up had its own language if you knew how to hear it. Birds calling their territories, a distant elk bugling, the rustle of small creatures moving through undergrowth brush. All of it told him the mountain was at peace, and so was he. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his hand-carved wooden pipe, turning it over in his palm before packing it with tobacco. The pipe had been his companion for nearly a decade, carved from a piece of birch during his first winter alone. He'd worked on it through long, dark evenings, shaping it slowly, getting every curve just right. The wood had darkened and smoothed with years of use, fitting his hand like it belonged there. He lit it now, drew in the smoke, and let it out slowly into the cold morning air. This was his life, simple, solitary, exactly what he needed it to be. Jacob had come to these mountains as a broken man. Back in '68, fever had swept through the small Missouri town where he'd been trying to build a life with his wife Sarah and their daughter Emma. He'd been away, guiding a hunting party through the Ozarks to earn money for the winter. By the time he returned, they were both gone, buried in the town cemetery under a pair of simple wooden crosses. The guilt of not being there, of choosing work over family on what turned out to be their last days, had nearly destroyed him. For months, he'd wondered, unable to stay in the house they'd shared, unable to look at Emma's rag doll still sitting on her bed. Eventually, he just started walking west. He didn't plan it, didn't have a destination. He just walked, trying to outrun the memories. These mountains had finally stopped him. Something about their permanence, their indifference to human suffering, had offered him a strange kind of comfort. Here, his grief didn't matter. The mountain didn't care if he cried or raged, or sat in silence for days. It simply existed, and slowly he'd learned to exist alongside it. He built his cabin by hand over the course of 2 years. Cut every log, notched every joint, chinked every gap with mud and moss. It wasn't large, just one room with a sleeping loft, but it was solid and warm. He'd positioned it in a small clearing, surrounded by pine and aspen, with the creek nearby and a good view down the valley. In summer, wildflowers carpeted the meadow. In winter, snow piled shoulder high, and he'd spend weeks without seeing another soul. That suited him fine. His days followed a rhythm set by the seasons. Spring and fall were for trapping beaver and marten, their pelts bringing good prices when he made his rare trips to the trading post in Stony Creek, 2 hard days' ride to the southeast. Summer was for hunting and putting up meat, gathering herbs and roots, tending the small garden he'd coaxed from the rocky soil. Winter was for survival, for mending equipment, for sitting by the fire and remembering that he'd made it through another year. He didn't consider himself a hermit exactly. He simply preferred his own company to most others. The few trappers and prospectors who occasionally passed through his territory knew him as a fair man, honest in his dealings, helpful if someone was truly in need. But he didn't seek out companionship, didn't join them for drinks or stories when he visited the trading post. He conducted his business and returned to his mountain. People probably thought he was lonely. They were wrong. Loneliness and solitude were different things. He'd chosen this, built it deliberately, and most days it was enough. This morning he had work to do. His trapline needed checking, a good 6-hour circuit through the high country. He finished his coffee, dampened the fire to coals, and gathered his gear. His rifle, a well-maintained Winchester he'd owned since his army days, went over his shoulder. Knife on his belt, canteen, a leather pouch with jerky and hardtack. He moved with economy, no wasted motion. Every item had its place, every action its purpose. The trail up from his cabin was steep but familiar. His legs carried him steadily upward through stands of lodgepole pine, across scree slopes where he had to watch his footing, past the clear pools where he sometimes saw beaver working in the early morning. He checked each trap methodically, resetting the ones that had been sprung empty, collecting 2 good marten from the others. The pelts were prime, thick and glossy. They'd fetch a fair price. By midday, he was high enough to see down the valley to the west. From this vantage point, the world spread out in layers of green and grey, mountains marching off toward horizons he'd never explored and had no desire to. This was his country, and he knew it like some men knew their wives' faces. But today, something was different. He paused, hand shading his eyes, and studied the valley below. There, maybe 3 miles distant, movement caught his attention. Riders, 3 of them, moving fast along the old ranch road that wound through the bottomland. Jacob frowned. Riders weren't unusual exactly, but something about their pace, the way they seemed to be searching rather than simply traveling, made him uneasy. He watched until they disappeared into the timber, then continued his rounds. Probably nothing. Probably just cowboys from one of the ranches down in the flats, looking for strays. But the unease stayed with him, a small prickle at the back of his neck that he'd learned long ago not to ignore. By late afternoon, he'd completed his circuit and started back toward his cabin. The sun was lowering, painting the mountainsides in gold and amber. A good day's work. His pack was heavier with the pelts, and he was looking forward to an evening by the fire, maybe reading a few pages from the worn copy of Virgil he kept on his shelf. Latin was slow-going, but he enjoyed the challenge, and time was something he had in abundance. He was maybe a mile from home when he noticed the smoke. Not from his cabin, the direction was wrong. It came from further south, down where old Gunderson's abandoned barn still stood. The Norwegian had tried ranching up here 5 years back, failed and moved on. The barn was all that remained, slowly collapsing in on itself. Jacob altered his course, moving quietly through the trees. Probably just travelers taking shelter, but after seeing those riders earlier, caution seemed wise. As he got closer, he slowed, every sense alert. No voices, no sound of horses, just that thin column of smoke rising into the evening sky. Then he saw her. A woman, collapsed against the barn's weathered wall, one arm pressed to her shoulder. Her dress dark with what even from 30 yards away he recognized as blood. Jacob dropped his pack and moved forward in a crouch, rifle ready, but pointed down. As he closed the distance, details emerged that told a story he didn't like. The woman's dress, though torn and stained, was fine silk, the kind that cost more than most folks earned in a year. Her boots were quality leather, custom-made by the look of them. One hand clutched her shoulder, where blood seeped between her fingers, dark and steady. Her face was pale, lips almost colorless, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. She was dying, and she was alone. Jacob scanned the area quickly, looking for threats, for whoever had done this to her. The barn stood empty and silent. No horses nearby, no sign of anyone else. Just this woman, bleeding out against sun-bleached wood while the day faded around her. He moved to her side and knelt down. "Ma'am," he said quietly, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open. They were brown, he noticed, dark as creek stones, and filled with pain and something else, fear. When she saw him, she tried to pull away, a weak movement that made her gasp. "Easy now," Jacob said, setting his rifle aside where she could see it was out of reach. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Jacob Stone. I live up in these mountains. You're hurt bad, and I need to look at that wound." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to decide if she could trust him. Then her strength gave out, and she sagged back against the barn. "Shot," she whispered. "They shot me. I can see that." "Who shot you? Where are they now?" "Gone. Thought I was dead." Her words were slurred, consciousness slipping. "Left me." Jacob didn't waste time with more questions. He could see the bullet had entered high on her left shoulder, probably missed the lung, but hit muscle and maybe bone. She'd lost a lot of blood and shock was setting in fast. If he didn't get her stabilized soon, the who and why wouldn't matter, because she'd be past caring. He shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her, then quickly assessed what he had to work with. His knife was sharp. He had whiskey in his pack for sterilizing, though not much. Bandages would have to be improvised. The barn offered some shelter from the wind that was picking up as evening approached. "I'm going to move you inside," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him anymore. "It's going to hurt, but we need to get you out of the wind." He lifted her as gently as he could, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. She was lighter than he expected, almost fragile in his arms. She moaned when he shifted her wounded shoulder, but didn't fully wake. He carried her into the barn, where the last of the day's light slanted through gaps in the walls, and laid her on a relatively clean patch of ground. He quickly swept clear of debris, working quickly. Jacob built a small fire in the shelter of the barn's corner, where the smoke would draft up through the missing roof sections. He needed light to work and warmth to fight the shock. While the fire caught, he unpacked his gear and took stock. Not ideal, but he'd worked with less. He cut away the fabric around her wound, revealing the damage. The bullet had punched through the fleshy part of her shoulder, front to back. Exit wound meant the bullet hadn't lodged, which was good. But the damage was substantial, and she was still bleeding. He needed to stop that first. Jacob worked with the focused calm that came from years of dealing with injuries in remote places. He'd set broken bones, stitched cuts, even pulled an arrow from a prospector's leg once. This was bad, but he'd seen worse. He cleaned the wound as best he could with whiskey and water from his canteen, packed it with strips torn from her petticoat, the cleanest fabric available, and bound it tight to apply pressure. She woke during this, crying out, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. Her eyes found his, wild with pain. "I know," he said softly. "I know it hurts. But I have to stop the bleeding. Stay with me now?" "They found me," she gasped. "The contracts." "They found me? Who found you?" But she was fading again, her grip loosening. Jacob finished the bandaging, then wrapped her in his blanket and positioned her close to the fire. He checked her pulse. Thready but steady enough. She was fighting, which was good. Vitas had a chance. As full darkness settled over the valley, Jacob maintained his vigil. He kept the fire going, monitored her breathing, changed the bandage once when blood soaked through. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering words he couldn't quite catch. Names, maybe. Places. Once she said clearly, "Thomas, I tried," and the grief in her voice was something he recognized bone deep. Around midnight, she woke more fully. Her eyes were clearer, focused. She looked at him across the fire, taking in his weathered face, his careful hands, the rifle propped nearby. "You're still here," she whispered. "Nowhere else to be. You don't even know me." Jacob added a piece of wood to the fire. "Don't need to know someone to help them." She was quiet for a moment, watching him. "Then Catherine." "My name is Catherine." "Catherine," he repeated, nodding. "That's a good start. How bad is it?" He considered lying, decided she deserved the truth. "Bad enough. You've lost a lot of blood. Wounds clean now, but infection's always a risk. You need rest, food, and time to heal. Days, not hours. I don't have days." Her voice was urgent despite her weakness. "They'll come back. When they realize I'm not dead. Who are they, Catherine?" She closed her eyes. "Men who want what I have. Men who'll do anything to get it. And what do you have that's worth killing for?" Before she could answer, a sound cut through the night. Distant but distinct. Horses. Multiple horses moving through the valley below. Jacob moved to the barn door and looked out. In the moonlight he could see them. 4 riders, maybe 5, spread out in a search pattern. They had torches, and they were working their way methodically up from the old ranch road, checking every building, every drawer. He turned back to Catherine. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Them?" he asked. She nodded. Jacob made his decision in that instant. He didn't know this woman, didn't know her story, or what she might have done to bring armed men hunting her. But he knew what he'd seen in her eyes, and he knew what it felt like to be alone and hurting with nowhere to turn. Whatever else she might be, right now she was someone who needed help, and helping people, even when it complicated things, was apparently something he still knew how to do. "We can't stay here," he said, already moving. "Can you ride?" "I don't have a horse." "They took her. Then you'll ride with me. We're 2 miles from my cabin. Rough trail, but it's defensible and they don't know where it is." He was packing as he spoke, scattering the fire. "We need to move now, while they're still down valley." "You don't have to do this," Catherine said, struggling to sit up. "You don't owe me anything." Jacob helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "Maybe not, but I'm doing it anyway." He retrieved his pack, shouldered his rifle, and wrapped his arm around her waist to support her weight. Together, they slipped out the back of the barn and into the forest, leaving nothing but cold ashes and blood-stained silk behind. The mountain darkness swallowed them whole, and somewhere below, torches flickered like angry stars searching for prey they wouldn't find. Dawn came slowly to the high country, light seeping through the pines like water through cupped hands. Jacob had been awake for hours, keeping watch from his porch while Catherine slept inside. The journey back to his cabin had taken twice as long as usual, supporting her weight while navigating the steep trail in darkness. She'd made it without complaint, but he'd felt her strength fading with each step. By the time they arrived, she could barely stand. He'd given her his bed, a simple frame with a rope mattress and wool blankets. She'd protested weakly, but he'd insisted. He took the floor near the hearth, his rifle within arm's reach. Old habits from his army days. Always sleep where you can grab your weapon. Now, with morning light revealing the valley below, peaceful and empty, he allowed himself to relax slightly. No sign of pursuit. The riders had apparently given up their search, at least for the night. That bought them time, but not much. Men determined enough to shoot a woman and leave her for dead wouldn't give up easily. Inside the cabin, he heard movement. Careful sounds, someone trying to be quiet. He rose and entered to find Catherine sitting on the edge of the bed, pale but awake. One hand pressed to her bandaged shoulder. "You should be lying down," he said. Moving to the hearth to stir up the fire, "I've been lying down for hours." Her voice was stronger than last night, though still strained. "I need to move, or I'll stiffen up worse." Jacob nodded, understanding that logic. He'd seen enough injuries to know that sometimes movement, careful movement, helped healing more than complete stillness. He hung a pot of water over the fire to heat. "I'll make tea. Willow bark, for the pain and fever. Not pleasant tasting, but it works. You know medicine. Enough to get by. When you live this far from a doctor, you learn what you need to." He measured dried bark into a cup. "The wound looks clean still, but I'll need to change the dressing after you've had something to drink." Catherine watched him work, and he could feel her studying him, trying to understand what kind of man would take in a stranger, risk his own safety for someone he didn't know. He'd been wondering the same thing about himself through the long night. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally. Jacob poured the hot water, let the tea steep. Seemed like the right thing to do. Most men wouldn't have. Most men would have kept riding, not wanted the trouble. "Maybe I'm not most men." He handed her the cup. "Drink. It's bitter, but it'll help." She sipped, made a face, but continued drinking. While she did, Jacob prepared a simple breakfast from his stores. Cornmeal mush sweetened with a bit of honey, strips of dried venison. Nothing fancy, but it was nourishing. They ate in companionable silence. Jacob noticed she had good manners, despite her obvious hunger, the kind of refinement that came from careful upbringing. Her hands, even roughened and bruised, were well kept. The nails had been shaped, though they were broken now. Everything about her spoke of a life very different from his own. After breakfast, he changed her bandage. The wound was angry red around the edges, but showed no signs of infection yet. The bleeding had stopped. He cleaned it again with boiled water and whiskey. Applied a poultice of yarrow and plantain he kept dried for such purposes, and rewrapped it with clean cloth. "You're good at this," Catherine said, watching his hands work with gentle efficiency. "Practice. Living alone means being your own doctor, blacksmith, carpenter. You learn or you don't survive. How long have you been alone up here?" 15 years, give or take." "That's a long time." She paused. "Don't you get lonely?" Jacob tied off the bandage and sat back. "Sometimes. But lonely's different than alone. Alone is a choice. I chose this. Why?" It was a simple question, but the answer was complicated. He considered deflecting, keeping his history private as he usually did. But she'd shared her vulnerability with him, trusted him with her life. That seemed to demand a certain honesty in return. "I had a wife," he said quietly.
"And a daughter."
"Fever took them while I was away working. By the time I got back, they were already in the ground." He stared at the fire. "I couldn't stay in that town, in that house. Every corner held memories. So I left." Catherine's eyes filled with sympathy, the kind that only came from understanding that particular brand of loss. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Time doesn't always help, though, does it? Not with some things." Jacob looked at her, saw in her face that she knew what she was talking about. "No," he agreed. "Not always." She shifted position, wincing slightly. On the small table beside the bed, Jacob noticed something he hadn't seen before. A locket, gold, with initials engraved on it. CH. It must have fallen from her pocket when he'd laid her down last night. He picked it up. "This yours?" Catherine's hand went to her throat, feeling for it, then relaxed when she saw it in his palm. "Yes, thank you." He handed it to her and watched as she opened it. Inside was a photograph, the image small but clear. A man, handsome, well-dressed, with kind eyes and a slight smile. Someone important to her, clearly. "Your husband?" Jacob asked gently. She nodded, her thumb tracing the image. "Thomas, he died 2 years ago." Her voice caught. "I thought I'd lost this last night. It's all I have left of him. He looks like a good man." He was. "The best." She closed the locket, held it tight in her fist. "He built something important, something that helped people. And when he died, he left it all to me. I've been trying to hold it together, to honor what he created. But there are men who think a woman can't run a business, can't make decisions. They want to take it from me. The men who shot you." Yes, Jacob fed more wood to the fire, thinking, what kind of business are we talking about? Catherine was quiet for a moment, and he could see her debating how much to tell him. Finally she said, "Mining operations. Thomas owned 3 silver mines, the largest in the territory. He also controlled water rights for half the valley settlements, owned the freight company that moved supplies, and held contracts with the army for horses and grain." Jacob let out a low whistle. "That was more than just a business. That was an empire. So you're saying you're rich. I'm saying I have responsibilities. Hundreds of people depend on those operations for their livelihoods. If the wrong people take control, they'll gut the safety measures, cut wages, drive people out. Thomas cared about his workers, treated them fairly. His partners, the ones who are after me now, they only care about profit. They want you to sign it over to them, or die trying to stop them. Either works for them." She met his eyes. "I'm sorry I brought this to your door, Jacob. You saved my life, and I've repaid you by putting you in danger." Jacob stood, walked to the window, and looked out at his mountain. He'd come here to escape complications, to live simply. And now, here was Catherine, bringing with her exactly the kind of trouble he'd spent 15 years avoiding. But when he turned back to her, saw her sitting there, trying to be brave despite the pain and fear, he realized something. Maybe he'd been alone long enough. Maybe hiding from the world wasn't the same as healing from it. "We'll figure it out," he said. "For now you need to rest and get strong. We'll worry about the rest when you're on your feet." Catherine smiled, small but genuine. "Thank you, Jacob." He nodded and returned to his work, but something had shifted in the cabin. It no longer felt quite so empty. 3 days passed, with the rhythm of careful recovery. Catherine grew stronger each morning, her color returning, the tight lines of pain around her eyes gradually easing. Jacob maintained his usual routines, but adjusted them to account for his guest. He checked his nearest trap lines, but stayed close to the cabin, always within earshot. He hunted, bringing back grouse and rabbit to supplement their meals. And he watched, always watched for any sign of the men who'd hurt her. On the third afternoon, while Catherine slept, Jacob went to tend to her horse. He'd found the animal the morning after their flight to the cabin, grazing in a meadow a mile downslope. A fine mare, well-bred and well cared for, with a saddle worth more than Jacob earned in a year of trapping. He'd brought her back and settled her in the small lean-to he used for his own mount during the worst weather. Now, as he unsaddled her to check for any injuries, he noticed the saddlebags were still attached. He hesitated, respecting privacy, but practicality won out. If there was anything in there Catherine might need, medicine or personal items, better to know now. The first bag held the expected items. A change of clothes, personal necessities, a small purse with coins. But the second bag held something different. A book, leather-bound and substantial, its pages filled with columns of numbers, names, and notations. Jacob pulled it out, frowning. He'd assumed it was a diary at first, but as he flipped through the pages, he realized it was something else entirely. Business records, detailed and extensive. Mining yields, payroll records, contract terms, land parcels. This wasn't a diary. This was a ledger, the kind of records that represented significant wealth and power. He brought it back to the cabin. Catherine was awake, sitting by the fire with a blanket around her shoulders. She looked better, stronger, though she still moved carefully to favor her injured shoulder. "Found your horse," Jacob said, setting the ledger on the table. "She's fine, no injuries." "But this was in your saddlebag." Catherine's eyes went to the book, and something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe, or concern. She reached for it, pulled it close. "Thank you. I was worried they'd taken it. What is it?" She ran her hand over the leather cover. "Records. Everything Thomas built, all of it documented here. Mining claims, contracts, employee rosters, accounts." She opened it, and Jacob could see pages dense with information. It's not just a ledger. It's proof of ownership, proof of legitimate business practices, proof of everything. Jacob pulled up a chair. "Catherine, what exactly are you involved in?" She looked at him, seemed to weigh how much to tell him, then made a decision. She turned the ledger toward him, pointing to entries. The Hartwell Mining Company owns 3 major silver operations in Colorado and Wyoming territories. We employ 400 men. Thomas also acquired water rights across 60,000 acres, which we lease to ranchers and farmers at fair rates. The freight company moves goods from the railhead to settlements throughout the region. She flipped pages, showing him more. Thomas believed in building something lasting, something that helped communities grow. He paid fair wages, invested in safety measures, dealt honestly. But someone else wants to run it differently, Jacob said, understanding dawning. His business partners, 3 men he trusted, who helped him build the company. But after he died, they showed their true intentions. They want to consolidate control, cut costs by any means necessary, maximize profits regardless of the human cost. Her voice hardened. "They've been sabotaging my authority for 2 years, turning board members against me, spreading rumors that I'm incompetent, that a woman can't handle such responsibilities. They've blocked my access to accounts, questioned every decision I make. So you were running." "I was riding to Denver. There's a territorial judge there, an honest man who knew Thomas. I have evidence of their schemes, their attempts to defraud investors, their plans to strip the company assets. I was going to file formal charges, get injunctions to protect the workers and the operations." She touched the bandage on her shoulder. "They found out, sent men to stop me." Jacob absorbed this, understanding now the stakes involved. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and the livelihoods of hundreds of people. "This ledger," he said, "they'll want it. Desperately. It contains everything they've tried to hide. Without it, their word against mine. With it, I can prove everything." Jacob stood, walked to the window. Below, the valley lay peaceful in the afternoon sun. But he'd learned in the war that peace was often just the pause between fights. "You said you're a widow," he said quietly. "That your husband died 2 years ago." "Yes. How did he die?" The silence stretched long enough that Jacob turned to look at her. Catherine was staring at the ledger, her jaw tight. "They said it was his heart. He collapsed at the office, died before the doctor arrived." She raised her eyes to his. But Thomas was strong, healthy. He'd just passed a medical examination for life insurance, and in the weeks before his death, he'd discovered irregularities in the accounts. He told me he suspected one of his partners was embezzling, that he planned to confront them. "You think they killed him?" "I can't prove it, but yes, I think they killed him. And now they're trying to kill me so they can take everything he built and twist it into something ugly and exploitative." Jacob returned to the table, sat down. "You can't fight this alone, Catherine. I'm not giving up. I owe Thomas that much. I owe the workers that much. I'm not suggesting you give up. I'm saying you need help. You need allies," she smiled sadly. "I had allies. They're either bought off or too frightened to stand with me now. That's why I was riding to Denver alone. There's no one left I can trust." "You can trust me," Jacob said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. Catherine looked at him, something soft and grateful in her expression. "You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're fighting for something that matters. I know you're brave enough to keep fighting, even when you're hurt and alone. That's enough." She reached across the table and took his hand, squeezed it gently. "You're a good man, Jacob Stone." He squeezed back, then released her hand and stood. "We should eat. You need to keep your strength up." As he prepared their supper, Jacob's mind was already working through possibilities, through plans. He'd thought he was done with the world of men and their conflicts. But apparently, the world had found him anyway, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what both he and Catherine needed. By the end of the first week, Jacob made a decision. The cabin was isolated but not secure enough, not if determined men came looking. They needed to move Catherine to safety, and she needed to continue healing in a place where she could defend herself if necessary. His cabin would serve that purpose better if properly prepared. But first, she needed to be strong enough to help with her own defense. "We're staying," he told her over breakfast on the 7th morning. "But things need to change. You need to learn to move in this country, to defend yourself if it comes to that." Catherine set down her cup. Her shoulder had healed remarkably well, the wound closing clean, her range of motion returning. "Teach me." And so began a different kind of education. Jacob started with the basics. How to move quietly through the forest, how to read tracks and signs, how to find water and identify edible plants. Catherine proved an attentive student, absorbing everything he showed her with focused determination. She had, he realized, the same quality Thomas must have seen in her, an ability to face challenges directly, to learn what needed learning without complaint. One afternoon, as they walked the perimeter of his property, Jacob pointed out landmarks and escape routes. "If trouble comes and we're separated, you head northeast to that rocky outcrop. See it where the pines thin out? There's a cave behind those boulders, well hidden. You can hole up there for days if needed, and there's a spring 20 yards to the east. You've thought this through," Catherine observed. "Spent 15 years thinking through how to survive up here. Pays to be prepared." She paused on the trail, looking back at the cabin nestled in its clearing. "This is a good life you've built, Jacob. Peaceful. I'm sorry my troubles have disturbed it. Maybe it needed disturbing," he said, surprising himself with the honesty. Over meals, they talked more freely. Catherine told him about growing up in Philadelphia, daughter of a school teacher, how she'd met Thomas when he came east seeking investors for his mining ventures. He was so passionate about building something ethical, something that would last. Most men in mining just wanted to extract wealth and move on. Thomas wanted to create communities, to treat workers with dignity. "Sounds like a rare man," Jacob said. "He was." She smiled at the memory. "He convinced my father, who convinced others. We raised the capital, moved west, and Thomas kept every promise he made. He built schools near the mines, insisted on safety protocols, paid fair wages, People thought he was foolish, that he'd never turn a profit. But he did, because men who are treated well work harder, stay longer, build loyalty, and you helped him build it. I tried. I managed the books, handled correspondence, learned the business. She looked down at her hands. After he died, I thought I could continue his work. But I underestimated how much resistance there would be to a woman in charge. Jacob cleaned his plate, considering. You said your husband's partners are behind this. 3 men? Yes, Harrison Dalton, Marcus Boone, and Frank Sutherland. They each own 15% of the company. Thomas left me controlling interest, 55%, with instructions that his vision should be maintained. The remaining shares are held by smaller investors. These 3, they were with Thomas from the beginning. Dalton was. He put up some of the initial capital, helped scout locations. Boone came in later, brought railroad connections. Sutherland handles legal affairs, or did until he started blocking my every move. She paused. Dalton's the one pushing hardest. He's always resented that Thomas held majority control, that he couldn't make unilateral decisions. Jacob filed this information away. Know your enemy, that was the first rule. When you're strong enough, we'll ride down to Stony Creek, small settlement 2 days from here. There's a telegraph office. We can wire your judge in Denver, let him know you're alive and safe. Won't that tell Dalton where I am? Not if we're careful. We send the message through someone trustworthy. Keep your location vague. He stood, began clearing dishes. But that's down the road. First you need to be able to ride all day and handle a gun. The weapons training began the next morning. Jacob had 2 rifles, his Winchester and an older Henry repeater, plus a Colt revolver he'd carried in his army days. He started Catherine with the pistol, teaching her the basics in the clearing behind his cabin. It's heavier than I expected, she said, hefting the Colt. That weight means power. Respect it, but don't fear it. He showed her how to load, how to sight, how to breathe and squeeze, rather than jerk the trigger. You're not trying to be a sharpshooter. You just need to be able to hit something man-sized at close range. Her first shots went wide, the recoil surprising her. But she adjusted quickly, and by the end of the session, she was grouping shots on the target he'd set up, a piece of wood with a charcoal circle marked on it. Better, Jacob said. Keep practicing. Muscle memory matters. That evening, as the sun set behind the peaks and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, they sat on Jacob's porch and simply existed together. Catherine had wrapped herself in a blanket against the cooling air, and Jacob smoked his pipe, the familiar ritual grounding him. I've been thinking, Catherine said quietly, about what happens after. After what? After we get word to the judge, after I testify against Dalton and the others. After justice is served, if it is. She turned to look at him. I'll have to go back. Return to managing the company, to that life. But I don't know if I can, Jacob. These weeks here, even hurt and frightened, I felt more at peace than I have in 2 years. Jacob understood what she was saying, the pull between duty and desire. You have people depending on you. That matters, I know. Thomas's workers, their families. I can't abandon them to Dalton's greed. She pulled the blanket tighter. But I also can't help thinking about what I want for the first time in a long time. He didn't ask what that was. Some things were better left unspoken, at least for now. Instead, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something he'd been carrying, a silver pocket watch engraved with elegant script. He held it out to Catherine. Found this in your saddlebag when I was putting your things away. Figured it was important. Catherine took it and her breath caught. She ran her fingers over the engraving. To Thomas with eternal devotion. She opened it and a small photograph was mounted inside the cover. Thomas again, younger, laughing. I gave this to him on our first anniversary, she said softly. He carried it every day. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I thought it was buried with him. His valet must have kept it, returned it to his effects. He knew you loved him, Jacob said gently. I did. I do. She closed the watch, held it to her heart. But he's gone, and I'm still here, and I don't know how to honor his memory while also living my own life. Jacob set his pipe aside. Maybe honoring his memory means doing both, fighting for what he built, but also finding your own happiness. Seems to me he'd want that for you. Catherine looked at him, really looked at him, and Jacob felt something shift between them. A recognition, maybe, of what was building here in this isolated place. Something neither of them had been looking for, but both seemed to need. "How did you get to be so wise?" she asked. "Wouldn't call it wisdom. Just time to think, up here alone. Maybe you've been alone long enough." "Maybe," he agreed quietly. "Maybe I have." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged one by one above the mountain peaks. And for the first time in 15 years, Jacob didn't feel the weight of his solitude. He felt something else entirely, hope. The second week brought routine and rhythm. Catherine grew stronger daily, her wound now just a tender scar. She could ride, shoot with reasonable accuracy, and move through the forest without making the rookie mistakes of most city folk. More than that, she was adapting to mountain life with a grace that surprised Jacob. She learned to cook over an open fire, to mend clothing with efficient stitches, to read weather signs in the clouds and wind. They worked side by side, and slowly, without either acknowledging it directly, the cabin began to feel like a shared space rather than his space with a guest. One morning, Jacob was splitting wood when Catherine emerged from the cabin with something in her hand. She approached slowly, and he could see uncertainty in her expression. "I found this while straightening up," she said, holding out a folded piece of paper. "It fell from your coat pocket. I wasn't snooping, I promise." Jacob set down his axe and took the paper. He knew what it was before he unfolded it. A letter, old and worn, the creases deep from years of folding and unfolding. Sarah's handwriting, the last letter she'd ever written to him, posted while he was away on that final hunting trip. He'd carried it for 15 years. Reading it so many times he had it memorized. Simple words about daily life, about Emma's progress with her reading, about how they missed him and couldn't wait for him to come home. Written 3 days before the fever took them both. "I read the first line before I realized what it was," Catherine said softly. "I'm sorry. That was private." Jacob looked at the familiar handwriting, felt the old ache in his chest. But it was different now, somehow. Still painful, but no longer quite so sharp. "Her name was Sarah," he said. "My wife. This was the last letter she sent me. Got it 2 days after I buried her." Catherine moved closer, not touching, but present. "You don't have to talk about it. Maybe I need to." He carefully refolded the letter, slipped it back into his pocket. "I blame myself for years. If I'd been there, maybe I could have done something. Maybe I could have gotten the doctor sooner, or nursed them through it, or just been there so they didn't die alone." He picked up the axe again, needing something to do with his hands. "Took a long time to understand that fever doesn't care if you're there or not. It takes who it takes. But the guilt stayed anyway," Catherine said, understanding in her voice. "The guilt stayed." He split a log with a clean stroke. "That's why I came here. Figured if I was alone, I couldn't fail anyone else. That's not living, Jacob. That's just surviving." He split another log, then set the axe down and turned to face her. "You're right. But it was the best I could do for a long time." He paused. "Until you showed up bleeding in that barn and reminded me that sometimes people need help, and sometimes helping them is worth the risk." Catherine reached out and took his hand, her grip warm and steady. "I think maybe we've been helping each other." Before Jacob could respond, a sound cut through the morning air. The sharp crack of a twig breaking, too loud and too close to be an animal. Jacob's hand went instantly to the knife on his belt, his body shifting into alert readiness. "Inside," he said quietly but urgently. "Now." They moved quickly to the cabin. Jacob grabbed his rifle while Catherine retrieved the Colt he'd been teaching her to use. They positioned themselves at the windows, watching the tree line. For long moments, nothing. Then movement, subtle but deliberate. Someone was out there, moving through the forest with reasonable skill, but not quite enough to avoid detection by someone who knew these woods as well as Jacob did. "Stay quiet," he murmured. "Let's see what we're dealing with." A figure emerged from the pines. A man alone, middle-aged, with a weathered face and practical traveling clothes. He carried a rifle but held it casually, pointed down. As he approached the cabin, he called out, "Hello, the house." "I'm looking for Jacob Stone. I'm not here for trouble." Jacob studied him carefully. The man's stance, his voice, everything about him read as genuine. But Jacob hadn't survived 15 years in the wilderness by taking things at face value. "State your business," Jacob called back, rifle ready but not aimed. "Name's Will Hutchins. I work for the Hartwell Mining Company. Been searching these mountains for near about 2 weeks." He stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. "I'm looking for Mrs. Catherine Hartwell. Her people are worried sick about her." Catherine moved to stand beside Jacob at the window. "Will, is that really you?" The man's face lit up with relief. "Mrs. Hartwell? Thank God, we thought you were dead." Jacob kept his rifle ready. "How do we know you are who you say you are?" "Fair question." Will slowly reached into his coat. "I have a letter, signed by Judge Morrison in Denver. Mrs. Hartwell was supposed to meet him 3 weeks ago. When she didn't arrive, he sent word to the mining office. I'm the company foreman at the Black Mountain site. I've worked for the Hartwells for 8 years. Catherine touched Jacob's arm. "I know him. He's trustworthy. Thomas promoted him to foreman because he was one of the few men who stood up to Dalton when he tried to cut safety protocols." Jacob lowered his rifle but didn't set it aside. He opened the door and stepped out, positioning himself between Will and Catherine. "You can approach, slowly." Will came forward, handed over the letter. Jacob scanned it quickly. Official court letterhead, Judge Morrison's signature. It requested information about Catherine Hartwell's whereabouts and stated that she was under the court's protection while giving testimony in a matter of territorial fraud. "How did you find us?" Jacob asked, luck mostly and stubbornness. "I've been searching every canyon and valley in this range. Asked at every trading post and settlement. Fellow down at Stony Creek mentioned a mountain man living up this way. Thought maybe he'd seen something." Will looked past Jacob to Catherine. "Ma'am, what happened?" "There was blood at the Gunderson place, and your horse was found wandering." Catherine stepped out onto the porch. "Dalton's men ambushed me, shot me and left me for dead. Jacob found me and saved my life." Will's jaw tightened. "We suspected Dalton was behind your disappearance. He's been telling everyone you fled with company funds, that you were unstable after Mr. Hartwell's death. He's been consolidating power, getting board votes to remove you as president. He can't do that without a legal finding," Catherine said. "He's got lawyers working on declaring you mentally incompetent to run the company. Says you had a breakdown, ran off into the wilderness." Will shook his head. "Some folks believed him, but a lot of us didn't. The workers, we know what you've done for us. How you've kept Mr. Hartwell's promises, even when the partners tried to break them." Jacob watched this exchange, filing away information. This was the world Catherine came from, the world of corporate politics and legal maneuvering. So different from his mountain solitude, yet she'd adapted to both with equal grace. "Will," Catherine said, her voice taking on the tone of command, "I need you to ride back to Denver. Give Judge Morrison my exact location and tell him I'm alive and safe. Tell him I have all the evidence he needs, and I'm ready to testify. Can you do that without Dalton finding out?" "Yes, ma'am." "I'll ride straight through, avoid the main office." He glanced at Jacob. "You keeping her safe up here?" "That's the plan," Jacob said. Will nodded, respect in his eyes. "Then I'll be back within the week, with the judge or his representatives." He turned to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Hartwell, the workers, we're behind you. Whatever you need, you just say the word." After Will disappeared back into the forest, Catherine and Jacob stood on the porch in silence. The game had changed. No longer was Catherine simply hiding and healing. Now the fight was coming to them. "You ready for this?" Jacob asked. Catherine's hand found the threatening letter, still tucked in her coat pocket, the one Jacob had discovered days ago. She pulled it out, read it again, then crumpled it deliberately. "I'm ready. Thomas built something good, and I won't let them destroy it." "Not without a fight," Jacob nodded, respecting her resolve. "Then we'd better prepare. If Will found us, others might too." That evening, as the sun dipped below the peaks and painted the valley in shades of copper and gold, Catherine spread the leather-bound ledger on Jacob's table. She'd been reviewing it methodically, checking entries, making notes on a separate sheet of paper. Jacob prepared their supper, but he found himself watching her work. There was something different about her when she focused on business matters. A sharpness, a confidence that came from years of experience. She wasn't just Thomas Hartwell's widow, playing at running a company. She was competent, intelligent, and clearly skilled at what she did. "Jacob," she said suddenly, her voice odd. "Come look at this." He moved to her side. She had the ledger open to a section marked with surveyor's notations and property descriptions. Coordinates, acreage, acquisition dates. "What am I looking at?" She pointed to an entry dated 5 years earlier. "This is a land acquisition Thomas made. 60,000 acres in Wyoming Territory, purchased from the federal government as part of the Homestead Act expansions." Her finger traced down the page. "He bought it for the mineral rights initially, thought there might be silver deposits. But the surveys came back negative, so he just held on to it. Planned to eventually sell it or lease grazing rights." Jacob studied the numbers, the legal descriptions. Something about them was familiar, but he couldn't place why. "Here," Catherine said, turning to a map tucked into the back of the ledger. She unfolded it, revealing a detailed survey map of Wyoming Territory. Her finger found a section marked in Thomas's handwriting. "These are the boundaries." Jacob leaned closer, and his blood went cold. The marked section included his valley, his mountain, the very ground his cabin stood on. "That's here," he said slowly. "This land, this is where we are right now." Catherine's face had gone pale. "I know. I just realized it when I was cross-referencing the coordinates." She looked up at him, stricken. "Jacob, according to this, Thomas owned your mountain. Which means now I own your mountain." Jacob stepped back from the table, trying to process this. For 15 years, he'd believed he was free here. He'd built his cabin, lived his life, assumed he was on open territory, land that belonged to no one or to the government, and therefore available to anyone willing to survive in it. Squatters' rights, the old-timers called it, but it had all been an illusion. "You own this land," he said flatly. "My cabin is on your property." "I didn't know," Catherine said urgently. "I swear to you I had no idea you were here. Thomas acquired thousands of acres scattered across the territories. We couldn't possibly track every squatter or trapper on all of it. We never enforced the boundaries on the remote parcels." Jacob walked to the window, stared out at the darkening valley. His valley. Except it wasn't his at all. It belonged to the woman he'd saved, the woman he was beginning to care for deeply. The irony was sharp enough to cut. "So what happens now?" he asked, not turning around. "You ride back to your empire and I get an eviction notice?" "No." Her voice was fierce. "Jacob, turn around and look at me." He did. She was standing now, the ledger open behind her, her eyes bright with determination. "This land means nothing to me, except that you're on it," she said. "The company has no use for it." "I have no use for it." She reached for the ledger, found the page with the deed information, and before Jacob could stop her, she tore it out. "Catherine, this land is yours," she said, holding the torn page. "I'll have new deeds drawn up, transferring ownership to Jacob Stone, legal and binding. You've built a life here, created something meaningful. I'm not going to take that from you. I don't want your charity," Jacob said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. Catherine's eyes flashed. "It's not charity. It's what's right." She moved toward him. "You think so little of me? You think I'd save my own life and then destroy yours by taking the one thing you've built? That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Jacob struggled to articulate the tangle of emotions. "I came here to be free, to own my life, to not be beholden to anyone. And now I find out that even this, even my isolation, was built on land someone else owned. On land you own, and I'm giving it to you." Catherine's voice rose. Free and clear, no strings attached. "Why is that so hard to accept?" "Because it changes things," Jacob said quietly. "Between us." The words hung in the air between them. Catherine stepped back, understanding dawning in her face. "You mean because we've been—" She paused, regrouping. "Because there's something happening between us, and now you think it's complicated by this, isn't it?" She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Jacob, I didn't plan any of this. I didn't plan to be shot and left for dead. I didn't plan to be rescued by a mountain man who turned out to be the kindest person I've met in years. I didn't plan to find out that he was living on land my late husband bought half a decade ago. She held up the torn deed page. But here we are, and I'm trying to do the right thing. The only thing that seems fair. Jacob took the page from her hand, studied Thomas Hartwell's precise handwriting, noting the acquisition. 60,000 acres for 10 cents per acre, $6,000 total. A fortune to Jacob, but probably pocket change to Hartwell. Your husband, Jacob said slowly. He was a good man, you said. Fair, honest, treated people right. He was. What would he do in this situation? Catherine considered this. Thomas would have been horrified to learn someone had been living on his land without knowing it was claimed. He'd have immediately offered to transfer the deed, just like I'm doing. And then he'd have probably wanted to meet you, to hear your story, to understand how you survived up here. She smiled sadly. He collected people in a way. Interesting people who knew things he didn't. He'd have liked you. Jacob looked at the deed page again, then at Catherine. The anger and confusion were fading, replaced by something more complex. She was right. This was complicated, but not in the way he'd first thought. It wasn't about charity or power or obligation. It was about two people trying to do right by each other in a situation neither had anticipated. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't have reacted like that. You were surprised. I understand. It's more than that. He set the deed on the table. For 15 years I've been alone, made my own decisions, answered to no one. And in the space of 2 weeks, you've turned my whole world sideways. I don't know how to navigate that. Catherine moved closer. Neither do I. My whole world is sideways too, Jacob. I'm supposed to be running a company, fighting legal battles in boardrooms. Instead, I'm in a mountain cabin with a man I barely know, but trust more than people I've worked with for years. She reached out, hesitantly, and touched his arm. I don't have answers, but I know this. I don't want to be another person who takes from you. I want to give you what's rightfully yours. Jacob covered her hand with his. The land matters, but it's not what matters most anymore. What does? He looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who'd come into his life wounded and desperate, who'd adapted to his world with grace and courage, who stood here now offering him everything while asking nothing in return. You do, he said simply. You matter most. Catherine's breath caught. She moved closer, and Jacob found himself pulling her into his arms, holding her carefully, mindful of her still healing shoulder. She fit against him perfectly, her head resting just beneath his chin, her arms wrapping around his waist. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding each other as the last light faded from the sky. Finally, Catherine pulled back enough to look up at him. What are we doing, Jacob? I don't know. But whatever it is, I think we should keep doing it, she smiled, and it transformed her face. I think so too. They kissed then, gentle and exploring, a first kiss that felt like both a question and an answer. When they parted, Catherine rested her forehead against his chest. This is going to be complicated, she said. Everything worth having usually is. I have to go back eventually. To the company, to the fight with Dalton. I can't just walk away from all those people depending on me. I know. But Jacob, I don't want to lose this. Whatever this is, he lifted her chin so she met his eyes. Then we'll figure it out. After we deal with Dalton, after you've secured the company, we'll figure out what comes next. Promise? Promise. They sealed it with another kiss, longer this time, full of promise and possibility. Outside, the mountain stood eternal and unchanging. But inside Jacob's cabin, everything had changed. Two people, both wounded by life, both seeking something they couldn't name, had found each other, and neither was alone anymore. 3 days after Will Hutchins rode out, Jacob stood on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness and felt the change in the air. He'd learned to trust these instincts during his years alone, the subtle sense that something was wrong, even when everything appeared normal. The forest was too quiet. The birds that should have been greeting the dawn were silent. Someone was coming. He returned to the cabin where Catherine was just waking. Get dressed, he said quietly. We may have company. She was alert immediately, no questions, no panic. In the weeks she'd spent here, she'd learned to trust his judgment about the mountain. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes they'd fashioned from his spare gear, secured the Colt he'd given her at her hip, and joined him at the window. "How many?" she asked. "Don't know yet. But I feel them out there. They didn't have to wait long." As the sun broke over the eastern peaks, 4 riders emerged from the tree line below. They moved in a loose formation, spread out, rifles visible across their saddles. Professional, military-trained or close to it. Jacob studied them through his field glasses, focusing on the leader. Middle-aged, well-dressed even for trail riding, with an air of authority that marked him as someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed. "That's Dalton," Catherine said, her voice tight. She'd moved beside him, looking through her own smaller glass. "Harrison Dalton. Thomas's partner. The one who's been trying to take everything." Jacob lowered his glasses. "He found us fast. Faster than I expected." "Will," Catherine said, realization dawning. They must have followed Will, or intercepted him. Jacob moved away from the window, began gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. Either way, they're here now. And they didn't come for a friendly conversation. He'd been preparing for this possibility since Will's visit, but hoping it wouldn't come to it. Now faced with the reality, he moved through his preparations with calm precision. He retrieved his old army rifle from where he'd hidden it in a cavity behind the cabin's back wall, wrapped in oiled cloth to keep it dry. A Winchester 73, modified for long-range accuracy, with the scope he'd fitted himself during his army days as a scout. Catherine watched him unwrap it. "You were a soldier, cavalry scout years ago." Before Sarah and Emma, he checked the rifle's action, found it smooth despite years of storage. Served 5 years on the frontier, tracking hostile war parties, mapping territories. Left the army to settle down. He loaded the magazine with practiced movements. "Never thought I'd need these skills again. Jacob, I won't let you die for me." He looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes. Not for herself, but for him. "And I won't let them take you." So we're at an impasse. He moved to the cabin's gun port, a narrow slot he'd cut years ago for just such a situation. "But I've got some advantages. I know this mountain. They don't. I've got high ground and defensive position. And I've got motivation." "What motivation?" "You," he said simply. Below, the riders had stopped about 300 yards out, just beyond effective rifle range. Smart. They were taking stock of the situation, planning their approach. Jacob settled into position, the rifle's familiar weight comforting in his hands. "Catherine, you remember what I taught you about defensive shooting? Aim for center mass, don't waste ammunition, and don't shoot unless you have a clear target." "Good. Take the east window. If they try to flank us, that's the most likely direction." He glanced at her. "But Catherine, if things go bad, if they get past me, you take that tunnel to the creek and you run. Don't look back, don't wait for me. You get to the cave I showed you and you hide until help comes. Jacob, promise me." She met his eyes and he saw the conflict there, but finally she nodded. "I promise." The standoff stretched through the morning. Dalton's men made no immediate move to advance, content to watch and wait. Jacob understood the tactic. They were hoping to wear down his nerves, to make him impatient enough to make a mistake. They didn't know Jacob Stone. Patience was something he had in abundance. Around midday, Dalton himself rode forward alone, stopping at the edge of effective range. He sat his horse confidently, a white flag tied to his rifle barrel. "Mrs. Hartwell," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I've come to talk to resolve this situation peacefully." Jacob glanced at Catherine. She shook her head firmly. "He's lying. Dalton doesn't do anything peacefully." "Your call," Jacob said. Catherine moved to the door but stayed inside, protected by the thick log walls. "I have nothing to say to you, Harrison. You shot me and left me to die." "A misunderstanding," Dalton called back. "My men were overzealous in trying to protect you. They thought you were being kidnapped, fleeing with company resources. I apologize for their excessive actions." "Liar!" Catherine's voice rang with anger. "You've been trying to force me out for 2 years. You killed Thomas." Even from this distance, Jacob could see Dalton's expression change. The mask of friendly concern dropped, replaced by something cold and calculating. "That's a serious accusation, Catherine." When you can't prove, his voice had lost its conciliatory tone. Be reasonable. You're not suited to running the company. Thomas knew it, which is why he kept you managing books and correspondence, not making real decisions. Sign over your shares, accept a generous settlement, and walk away. You can live comfortably for the rest of your days on blood money. Catherine's voice was steel. Never. Dalton's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. That mountain man you're hiding behind can't protect you forever. We can wait you out, or we can come take you. Either way, this ends with you signing those papers. Jacob had heard enough. He raised his voice, letting it carry. Dalton, this is private property, and you're trespassing. Turn around and ride out, or we'll have a problem. Dalton turned his attention to Jacob, assessing. You must be Stone, the hermit. How much is she paying you? Whatever it is, I'll double it, triple it. Just step aside and let us handle our business affairs. Not for sale, Jacob said flatly. Everyone's for sale. It's just a matter of price. Then you can't afford me. Jacob sighted down his rifle, put the crosshairs on Dalton's chest. You've got 10 seconds to start riding, or I demonstrate exactly how accurate this rifle is at 300 yards. For a long moment, Dalton sat absolutely still. Then slowly he smiled. You'd kill an unarmed man under a flag of truce? That makes you a murderer, Stone. Makes me a man protecting someone who needs protecting. Your choice. Ride out or find out. Dalton turned his horse without another word and rode back to his men. Jacob watched him through the scope, saw the brief conversation, the gestures, planning, preparing. They're not leaving, Catherine said. No, they're not. Jacob moved from the gun port, began checking his other defenses. Barricades he'd positioned at the windows, ammunition stores, water supply. They'll wait for dark, then try to rush the cabin. Standard tactic. How do we fight 4 armed men? Carefully, he looked at her, saw the determination in her face mixed with fear. Catherine, you need to know something. I've been in combat before. I've killed men when I had to. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's something I can do if necessary. Can you? She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. If it's them or us, yes, I can. Good. Because we're going to need every advantage we can get. They spent the afternoon preparing. Jacob showed Catherine how to reload his rifles quickly, how to position ammunition within easy reach. He explained his defensive strategy, where he expected them to attack from, how he'd respond. She absorbed it all, asking intelligent questions, suggesting adjustments based on her reading of Dalton's personality. He's arrogant, she said. Believes he's smarter than everyone else. Thomas used to say Harrison always had to be the one with the clever plan. He won't do the obvious thing if he can do something elaborate. Good to know. Jacob filed that away. Arrogant men make mistakes. As the sun began its descent toward the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, they shared a quiet meal. Neither had much appetite, but Jacob insisted they eat. Energy would matter when things started. Catherine sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Jacob, if this goes wrong, if something happens to me, I want you to know. Don't, he said gently. Don't say goodbye. We're going to get through this. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. He took her hand, squeezed it. And I've survived 15 years in these mountains by being very good at staying alive. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I'm glad I found you. Even with everything that's happened, I'm glad. Me too. They sat like that as the light faded, drawing strength from each other. Jacob's mind was already running through scenarios, calculating angles and responses. But for this moment, he let himself simply be present, holding Catherine's hand, feeling the warmth of her beside him. The mountain darkness came quickly, as it always did. Jacob and Catherine took their positions, rifles ready, nerves steady. Somewhere out in that darkness, Dalton and his men were preparing their assault. Jacob checked his rifle one last time, made sure Catherine had everything she needed within reach. Then he settled in to wait, his breathing slow and even, his mind clear. He'd survived 15 years alone on this mountain. Now he had something to fight for beyond simple survival. He had someone who mattered, someone worth protecting, and Harrison Dalton was about to learn that some old soldiers never lose their edge. No matter how long they've been away from the fight, they came at midnight, as Jacob expected. He dozed lightly through the early evening, trusting his instincts to wake him when needed. When his eyes opened in the darkness, he knew immediately they were making their move. The first indication was the horses. Dalton's men had moved them earlier, trying to be quiet, but Jacob had been listening. They'd positioned the animals south of the cabin, far enough away to muffle sound, but close enough for a quick escape if needed. Smart, but not smart enough. Jacob rose silently and moved to Catherine's position at the east window. She was awake, alert, her hand steady on the Colt's grip. "They're coming," he whispered. "Remember, aim for center mass. Don't waste shots." She nodded, face pale in the darkness but determined. Jacob returned to his position at the main gun port, the modified Winchester heavy and familiar in his hands. He'd fought Cheyenne war parties with this rifle, tracked Confederate raiders through Missouri swamps. The muscle memory was still there, buried under 15 years of peaceful living but not forgotten. Movement in the tree line. Jacob's eyes, adjusted to the darkness, caught it. Two figures, low and moving with tactical precision. They were trying to flank, approaching from different angles to divide his attention. Professional. These weren't just hired thugs. Dalton had brought men with military training. The attack came suddenly. Muzzle flash from 3 directions, bullets slamming into the cabin's log walls. Jacob had built well. The logs were thick, 18 inches of solid pine, but sustained fire would eventually find gaps. He returned fire at the eastern flash, heard a grunt of pain. "One down or wounded?" Catherine fired from her window, the Colt's report sharp in the confined space. Jacob couldn't tell if she hit anything, but her fire was disciplined, not panicked. "Good," he called to her. "Keep them pinned." The assault paused, regrouped. Jacob used the lull to reload, count remaining ammunition. Plenty for now, but a sustained siege would be problematic. They had food and water for days, but bullets were finite. A voice called from the darkness. Not Dalton, one of his men, Stone. "You're outnumbered. Send out Mrs. Hartwell and we'll leave you be." Jacob didn't bother responding. Talk was just another tactic, trying to locate his position by his voice. The second wave came harder. 2 men rushed the cabin from the south while the others provided covering fire. Bold move, but predictable. Jacob had prepared for exactly this. He'd strung tripwires earlier in the day, thin cords stretched across the most likely approach paths, tied to pots filled with rocks and scrap metal. When the rushing men hit the first wire, the pot tumbled and crashed, the noise explosive in the quiet night. The surprise gave Jacob the split second he needed. He fired through the gun port, saw one man go down hard. The second man dove behind the woodpile Jacob had stacked 30 yards from the cabin. Smart position, good cover. But Jacob knew something the man didn't. He'd left 2 cords of wood stacked deliberately, creating a seemingly perfect defensive position. What the man couldn't see in the darkness was that Jacob had angled the pile so it was exposed to the east window. "Catherine," he called. "Woodpile to your right." When behind it, she shifted position, aimed carefully. 3 shots, methodical and aimed. The fourth produced a cry of pain, and a figure stumbled out from behind the wood, clutching his leg. Jacob's shot was mercy as much as tactics. The man went down and didn't move again. Silence fell over the clearing. 2 men down for certain, maybe 3 if Jacob's first shot had been as accurate as he thought. That left Dalton and possibly one other, or did it? Jacob's combat instincts screamed warning. Something was wrong. The attack had been too straightforward, too predictable. Dalton was arrogant, yes, but Catherine had said he liked elaborate plans. "Catherine, check the back wall." She moved immediately, trusting his judgment. The sound came a heartbeat later, metal on wood. Someone working at the back of the cabin with a pry bar. While they'd been focused on the frontal assault, Dalton had been circling to the rear, trying to breach the cabin from the blind side. Clever and exactly the kind of elaborate approach Catherine had warned about. Catherine fired through the back wall, her shots punching through the chinking between logs. Return fire came immediately, too close. Jacob heard her cry out, "Catherine! I'm okay." Splinters, that's all. But Jacob was already moving, his rifle swinging toward the back wall. He couldn't see his target, but he knew the cabin's dimensions, could calculate angles. He fired 3 times through the logs at chest height, spacing his shots 18 inches apart. A scream, then a heavy thud as a body hit the ground outside. "Got him," Jacob said, but his heart was pounding. Too close. If Dalton had gotten inside, the front door exploded inward, the bar Jacob had set across it shattering under multiple kicks. Dalton himself stood silhouetted in the doorway, rifle raised, wild-eyed and desperate, and Catherine was 10 feet away, exposed, fumbling to reload her empty Colt. Time seemed to slow, the way it did in combat, when everything crystallized into pure clarity. Jacob saw it all in that frozen instant. Dalton raising his rifle, Catherine's wide eyes, the distance he'd have to cover to get between them. He wouldn't make it in time, but Catherine wasn't the woman who'd collapsed bleeding against a barn 3 weeks ago. She'd learned, adapted, become someone who could survive in this harsh country. Instead of freezing, she dove sideways, rolled behind the heavy oak table Jacob used for meals. Dalton's shot went wide, splintering wood where she'd been standing. Jacob's shot didn't miss. The bullet took Dalton high in the shoulder, spinning him around, his rifle clattering to the floor. He stumbled backward through the doorway, clutching the wound, shock and fury warring on his face. "You shot me," he gasped, as if the reality of violence had never truly touched him before. "You actually shot me!" Jacob advanced, rifle trained on Dalton's chest, finger steady on the trigger. "You broke into my home, tried to kill a woman under my protection. What did you expect?" Dalton leaned against the doorframe, blood seeping between his fingers. His face was pale, but his eyes held calculation even now. "You're a fool, Stone. You think this ends here. I have lawyers, judges on my payroll, politicians who owe me favors. I'll bury you in legal proceedings. You'll hang for this." "Maybe," Jacob said calmly. "But you won't be around to see it. You won't kill me." Dalton's voice gained confidence. "You're not a murderer. You're a hermit who helps wounded women. It's not in you." Jacob lowered his rifle slightly, and Dalton's expression shifted to triumph. He'd read Jacob correctly, or so he thought. Jacob was indeed a man who valued life, who'd built a peaceful existence far from violence. But Catherine moved forward, the Colt now loaded and steady in her hand, pointed directly at Dalton's heart. "He won't kill you," she said, her voice ice. "But I will." Dalton's eyes widened. "Catherine, don't be foolish. You're not a killer either. You're a society woman playing at business. You don't have it in you. You're wrong." Catherine's hand didn't waver. "You killed my husband. You tried to kill me. You would have destroyed everything Thomas built, ruined hundreds of lives for profit." She pulled back the hammer with an audible click. "I'm not playing anymore, Harrison. Wait." Dalton's composure cracked. "We can negotiate. I'll withdraw my claims, sign documents, whatever you want. Like you honored the agreements you made with Thomas?" Catherine moved closer. "Like you honored your partnership when you poisoned him?" Dalton's face went slack. "You can't prove that, no?" Thomas's doctor kept records. Symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning developed over months. I've had investigators looking into it since he died. And this ledger," she gestured to the book still on Jacob's table, "contains Thomas's personal notes. He documented every suspicious meeting, every altered contract, every irregularity he discovered. He was building a case against you, Harrison. That's why you killed him." "Catherine, shut up." Her voice cracked like a whip. "You're going to do exactly what I say. You're going to ride back to civilization with us. You're going to confess everything to Judge Morrison. You're going to sign over your shares in the company and withdraw any legal challenges to my authority. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison for murder and conspiracy. And if I refuse..." Catherine's smile was cold. "Then Jacob and I bury you up here in the mountains, and no one ever knows what happened to Harrison Dalton. You disappeared into the wilderness, just like you tried to make me disappear." Jacob watched this exchange with something like pride. This was the woman Thomas Hartwell had married, the woman who'd run a mining empire despite constant opposition. She'd been wounded and frightened when he found her, but she'd never been weak. Dalton seemed to recognize he'd lost. His shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him along with his blood. "I need a doctor." "You'll get one," Catherine said. After you agree to my terms, I agree. God help me, I agree. Good. Catherine lowered the Colt but didn't holster it. Jacob, check the others. Make sure they're no longer a threat. Jacob moved outside cautiously, rifle ready. 3 bodies lay in the clearing, none moving. He checked each one carefully. 2 dead, 1 unconscious but breathing. The man Dalton had sent to breach the back wall. He dragged the unconscious man inside, bound him with rope. They'd need him as a witness. Dawn was breaking over the peaks when Jacob returned to find Catherine had bandaged Dalton's shoulder, though not gently. She'd also retrieved a steel lockbox from beneath the cabin's floorboards, where Jacob kept his few valuables and emergency supplies. "I'm putting the ledger in here," she said, "along with Thomas's notes and the documents about land ownership. Everything we need to make our case." She locked it, pocketed the key. "No one touches this but the judge." Jacob nodded approval. "Smart." They secured Dalton and his surviving man, then set about the grim task of dealing with the dead. Jacob buried them on the mountain, marking the graves simply. Whatever else they'd been men, and deserved that much respect. By mid-morning, Will Hutchins arrived with a contingent of federal marshals and Judge Morrison himself. They'd been riding hard since dawn, Will having reached them in Denver and raised the alarm. The judge, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes and an air of absolute authority, surveyed the scene with practiced assessment. His gaze moved from the damaged cabin to the bound prisoners, to Catherine standing tall, despite her exhaustion. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said gravely, "I believe you have quite a story to tell." "I do, Your Honor, and evidence to back every word." She handed him the lockbox. "Everything you need is in here. Thomas's documentation, the company ledger, proof of conspiracy and murder." Judge Morrison took the box reverently. "I'll review it personally." He turned to Dalton, who sat slumped against a tree, his wounded shoulder bandaged, but his spirit broken. "Mr. Dalton, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and suspected murder of Thomas Hartwell. You'll be held in territorial custody pending trial." Dalton didn't respond, didn't even look up. The judge's attention shifted to Jacob. "And you must be Mr. Stone, the man who saved Mrs. Hartwell's life and held off 4 armed assailants." "Quite impressive. Just protected what needed protecting," Jacob said quietly. "Indeed." The judge smiled slightly. "The territory owes you a debt of gratitude, sir." As the marshals loaded Dalton and his man onto horses for the journey back to Denver, Catherine pulled the torn deed page from her pocket, the one she'd ripped from the ledger days ago. "Your Honor, one more matter. This land," she gestured to the mountain, the cabin, everything around them, "belongs to Jacob Stone. I'm transferring ownership legally and without condition. Can you witness the transfer?" Judge Morrison examined the deed, then looked at Jacob with new interest. "You're giving him 60,000 acres. "He's earned it," Catherine said simply. "And it's his home. Has been for 15 years. The judge prepared the paperwork on the spot, legal language that made Jacob's ownership absolute and uncontestable. Jacob signed, then Catherine, then the judge as witness. "Congratulations, Mr. Stone," the judge said, handing him the new deed. "You're now a substantial landowner." Jacob held the paper, looking at his name written in official script. For 15 years he'd lived here believing he owned nothing. Now he owned everything that mattered. The trial took 3 months. Catherine had to return to Denver to face board meetings and depositions and the endless machinery of territorial justice. Jacob went with her, staying in a boarding house while she managed her company and testified against Dalton. It was strange being in a town again after so many years, but Catherine made it bearable. They took walks in the evenings, dined together, talked for hours about everything and nothing. The verdict, when it came, was decisive. Dalton was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in Thomas Hartwell's death, attempted murder of Catherine, and multiple counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. His co-conspirators, Boone and Sutherland, faced lesser charges, but were removed from the company and barred from any future business in the territory. Catherine was unanimously confirmed as president and majority owner of the Hartwell Mining Company. She implemented immediate changes, improved safety protocols, fair wage increases, profit sharing for long-term employees. The workers, who'd stood by her throughout the ordeal, responded with loyalty and increased productivity. Within 6 months, the company was more profitable than ever, proving Thomas's philosophy that treating people well was good business. But success came with a price. The responsibilities were endless, the decisions weighty and constant. Catherine was good at it, brilliant even, but Jacob could see the toll it took. She grew tired, worn down by meetings and negotiations and the constant demands of hundreds of employees and their families. One evening in late autumn, as they sat in the private office she maintained in Denver, Catherine set down her pen and looked at Jacob with exhausted eyes. "I can't do this anymore," she said quietly. Jacob's heart clenched. "Can't do what?" "This, all of it." She gestured at the papers covering her desk, the ledgers and contracts and endless correspondence. "I've been fighting so hard to preserve Thomas's legacy, to honor what he built. But Jacob, this isn't my legacy. It was his dream, his passion. I've been living his life instead of my own. What do you want?" Jacob asked. Though he thought he knew, Catherine stood, moved to the window overlooking the bustling street below. "I want peace. I want to wake up to mountain air and birdsong. I want to split wood and tend a garden and live simply." She turned to face him. "I want the life you showed me was possible. You have 400 people depending on you. I know. That's why I've spent the last month preparing." She pulled a folder from her desk drawer. "Will Hutchins has agreed to take over as company president. He's smart, honest, and the workers trust him completely. I'm transferring my shares into a trust that will ensure Thomas's principles are maintained. The workers get profit sharing, safety standards remain high, and wages stay fair. It's all legally binding." Jacob absorbed this. "You're walking away." "I'm choosing what matters." She moved to him, took his hands in hers. "I'm choosing you if you'll have me." He pulled her close, held her tight. "I've been yours since the moment I found you bleeding against that barn." They were married the following week by Judge Morrison in a simple ceremony with Will Hutchins and a handful of trusted friends as witnesses. Catherine wore a simple dress, no silk or finery, and Jacob wore his best clothes, which weren't much better than his everyday wear. Neither cared. They were building something new, something that belonged to both of them. The journey back to the mountain took 4 days, riding slowly, enjoying the trip rather than rushing. Catherine had sold the grand house she'd shared with Thomas, keeping only a few precious items: Thomas's pocket watch, her wedding ring from her first marriage, and photographs of happier times. She wore both wedding rings now, the first on her right hand, the second on her left, honoring the past while embracing the future. When they crested the final ridge and Jacob's cabin came into view, Catherine drew a deep breath of pure relief. "I'm home," she said. "We're home," Jacob corrected. They spent the winter expanding the cabin, adding a second room, improving the hearth. Catherine proved handy with tools, learning carpentry with the same determination she'd shown learning to shoot and track. They worked side by side, building their life together literally and figuratively. Spring brought new routines. They planted a larger garden together, Catherine's knowledge of cultivation combining with Jacob's understanding of the mountain soil. They expanded the small barn for additional horses and a milk cow Catherine insisted on bringing up from the valley. Jacob taught her to fish, and she taught him to appreciate poetry, reading aloud in the evenings while he worked on various projects. One afternoon in early summer, as they sat on the expanded porch watching clouds drift across the peaks, Catherine pulled out a piece of paper and showed it to Jacob. A new deed. This one drawn up in her careful handwriting and properly witnessed in the last town they'd visited. "What's this?" Jacob asked. "Legal transfer of property," Catherine said. "This land was yours, but now it's ours. Both our names, equal ownership, partners in everything." Jacob read the document, saw their names side by side, Jacob Stone and Catherine Stone. He looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd given up an empire to build a life with him. "Partners," he agreed, signing the deed. "In everything." They witnessed each other's signatures. Then Catherine carefully folded the paper and placed it in the lockbox, where they kept their important documents. The same steel box that had once held evidence of murder and conspiracy now held marriage certificates and property deeds and letters from friends in the valley below. As the sun set that evening, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, Jacob and Catherine stood together on their land, arms around each other, watching the day end in beauty and peace. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked. "Giving up that life?" Catherine leaned into him, content. "Not for a single moment. Thomas built an empire, and it was magnificent. But you and I, we built something better. We built a home." "We did," Jacob agreed. The mountains stood eternal above them, witness to their journey from strangers to partners, from wounded souls to healed hearts. Two people who'd each lost everything had found each other, and in finding each other, had found everything that truly mattered. Below them, in the valley, a thin column of smoke rose from their cabin's chimney, marking the place they'd chosen to build their lives together. It was a small mark on a vast landscape, easily missed by anyone who didn't know to look for it, but it was theirs, earned through courage and kindness, and the simple choice to help a stranger in need. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.